I waited all night with the candles lit, watching the wax drip onto my grandmother's antique tablecloth while the roast beef grew cold and gray in its own congealing juices. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, each note echoing through our empty house like a funeral dirge for the evening I had so carefully planned. When I finally gathered the courage to call Michael's phone, my fingers trembling as I pressed each familiar digit, a woman answered with a voice that made my blood freeze in my veins. "Hello?" she said, and I knew immediately that this wasn't some random stranger who had found a lost phone or answered by mistake. This was the voice of someone comfortable, someone who belonged wherever Michael was at midnight on our wedding anniversary. Someone who had probably been expecting my call for hours while I sat alone like a fool, waiting for a husband who was never coming home. But what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about betrayal, about my marriage, about the very foundation of the life I had built over the past 18 years. The woman on the other end of the line wasn't Michael's secret mistress or some random hookup from his office Christmas party. She identified herself as Detective Sarah Chen from the Metropolitan Police Department, and she was calling from the emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital, where my husband had been found unconscious in his car 3 hours earlier, his vehicle wrapped around an oak tree on the outskirts of town. The first twist hit me like a physical blow as Detective Chen explained that Michael hadn't been driving drunk or texting while behind the wheel. The blood tests showed he had been drugged with a powerful sedative, something that would have made it impossible for him to maintain control of his vehicle. Someone had deliberately tried to kill my husband, and they had very nearly succeeded. I raced to the hospital through empty streets, my mind spinning with questions that had no answers. Who would want to hurt Michael? He was an accountant, for God's sake. A man whose biggest professional controversy had been questioning a client's expense reports. As I sat in the sterile waiting room, surrounded by the antiseptic smell of industrial cleaning supplies and fear, Detective Chen began asking me questions that made me realize how little I actually knew about the man I had been married to for nearly 2 decades. The second revelation came when Detective Chen showed me the contents of Michael's briefcase, which had been recovered from his car. Hidden beneath his everyday files and calculator was a stack of photographs that made my stomach turn. Not pornography or evidence of an affair, but surveillance photos of our neighbors, our friends, even our own daughter, taken from distances that suggested months of careful stalking. But the third twist was even more disturbing. These weren't just random stalking photos taken by some obsessed stranger who had fixated on Michael. The metadata on the digital images showed they had been taken with Michael's own camera, using equipment I had bought him for his birthday last year. My mild-mannered accountant husband had been secretly photographing people in our community for reasons I couldn't begin to understand. Detective Chen's investigation had only begun, but the fourth shock came when she revealed that Michael's name had appeared in an ongoing federal investigation into identity theft and financial fraud. Not as a victim or a witness, but as a person of interest in a scheme that had stolen over $2 million from retirees and disabled veterans across 3 states. The fifth twist arrived when I tried to call our daughter Jessica at college to tell her about her father's accident. The number I had been calling for months, the dorm phone that I thought connected me to Jessica's room at State University, was actually a forwarding service that routed calls to a completely different number. When I finally reached the real dormitory, the resident advisor told me that no student named Jessica Patterson had ever been enrolled at their school. My world tilted sideways as the sixth revelation hit me. The daughter I had been sending care packages to, the girl I had video chatted with every Sunday for the past semester, the young woman whose tuition I had been paying from our joint savings account didn't exist, at least not in the way I had understood her existence. Someone had been intercepting my calls, cashing my checks, and maintaining an elaborate deception that made me question everything I thought I knew about my own family.
Detective Chen's expression grew increasingly grim as she explained the seventh twist in this nightmare. The federal investigation that had flagged Michael's name wasn't just about financial fraud. It was about something much darker, a network of individuals who specialized in creating false identities for people running from their pasts. People who needed to disappear completely and permanently. The eighth shock came when Detective Chen showed me Michael's real driver's license, the one she had found in a hidden compartment of his wallet. His name wasn't Michael Patterson, it was David Kowalski, and according to FBI records, David Kowalski had been presumed dead for over 20 years, killed in a house fire that had also claimed the lives of his wife and infant daughter. I felt like I was drowning in revelations that kept coming faster than I could process them. The ninth twist was perhaps the cruelest of all. The house fire that had supposedly killed David Kowalski hadn't been an accident. It had been arson, deliberately set to cover up the murders of his real wife and child. David hadn't died in that fire because he had been the one who started it, and he had been living under Michael's stolen identity ever since. The man I had been married to for 18 years, the father of the daughter I now wasn't sure actually existed, was a murderer who had assumed a dead man's identity and built an entire fake life around that deception. But the 10th revelation was waiting to destroy even that terrible new reality I was trying to accept. Detective Chen received a phone call that changed her expression from professional sympathy to genuine alarm. The sedative that had been found in Michael's bloodstream wasn't some street drug or over-the-counter sleep aid that had been misused. It was a highly specialized compound used in psychiatric hospitals, something that could only be obtained by someone with medical training and access to controlled substances. The 11th twist came when the hospital staff confirmed that Michael had been conscious when the paramedics arrived at the accident scene. He hadn't been unconscious from the drugs or the impact of the crash. He had been pretending to be unconscious. And he had maintained that pretense for over 4 hours while doctors ran tests and police searched his belongings. Michael was awake, Michael was listening, and Michael was planning something that required everyone to believe he was incapacitated and harmless. The 12th shock arrived when I was finally allowed to see him. The man lying in that hospital bed looked exactly like my husband, but when he opened his eyes and looked at me, I saw a stranger. Not just because I now knew he was a murderer and an identity thief, but because something fundamental had changed in his expression, as if a mask had finally been removed. "Hello, Sarah," he said, and that was when the 13th revelation hit me. Sarah was the name of his first wife, the woman he had killed in that house fire 20 years ago. For 18 years of marriage, he had never really seen me as myself. He had been living with a replacement for the wife he had murdered, trying to recreate something he had destroyed with his own hands. The 14th twist came when Michael explained why he had been taking surveillance photos of our neighbors and friends. He had been documenting their routines, their habits, their vulnerabilities, because he was preparing to disappear again. The federal investigation was closing in on his true identity, and he needed to steal another life, another identity, to replace the Michael Patterson persona that was about to be exposed. But the 15th revelation was the most chilling of all. The daughter I thought I had been supporting at college, the Jessica whose voice I heard during those Sunday phone calls, was real. She just wasn't our daughter. She was the daughter of one of the neighbors Michael had been stalking, a girl he had been manipulating and coaching to impersonate our fictional child while he drained our bank accounts to fund his next disappearing act. The 16th shock came when Detective Chen brought the real Jessica into the hospital room, a frightened 19-year-old who had been told that participating in this elaborate deception was part of a federal witness protection program. Michael had convinced her that her real parents were in danger and that she was helping to keep them safe by pretending to be someone else's daughter. As I looked at this girl who had been calling me mom for months, I realized the 17th twist in this maze of deception. She looked exactly like photos I had seen of Michael's real daughter, the child who had died in that house fire 20 years ago. Michael hadn't just been using Jessica to steal money from me. He had been using her to recreate his murdered daughter, to build a fantasy family that could replace the one he had destroyed. The 18th revelation came when Michael finally admitted the truth about why he had been drugged. He hadn't been the victim of someone else's murder attempt. He had drugged himself, deliberately crashed his car, and orchestrated this entire scenario because he had discovered that I was much closer to learning his real identity than he had realized. For months, I had been having strange dreams, fragments of memories that didn't seem to belong to me. Dreams about a house fire, about screaming children, about a man who looked like Michael but younger, angrier, more violent. What I had dismissed as anxiety-induced nightmares had actually been recovered memories, pieces of suppressed trauma that were beginning to surface after nearly 20 years. The 19th and most devastating twist was still waiting to destroy whatever remained of my sanity. Detective Chen showed me a photograph from the original crime scene, a picture of the woman who had died in that house fire 20 years ago. The woman looked exactly like me. Not just a passing resemblance, but an uncanny similarity that suggested something far more disturbing than coincidence. Michael hadn't just assumed a dead man's identity when he became Michael Patterson. He had specifically sought out and seduced a woman who looked exactly like his murdered wife, because his plan had always been to recreate his original family down to the smallest detail. I wasn't his second wife. I was a carefully selected replacement for his first wife, chosen specifically because I could help him maintain the illusion that he had never really lost what he had destroyed. But the 20th and final revelation was the most shocking of all, because it came from my own recovered memories as the sedative Michael had given himself began to wear off and his story started falling apart. The house fire 20 years ago, the murdered wife and child. The man who had supposedly died in the flames while actually escaping to steal another identity. None of it had happened the way Detective Chen had described it based on the federal records. Michael hadn't killed his first family and then assumed David Kowalski's identity. Michael was David Kowalski, and I was his original wife, Sarah, the woman who was supposed to have died in that house fire. The trauma of that night had been so severe that it had caused me to develop complete amnesia about my previous life. For 20 years, I had been living with my own husband under false identities, both of us pretending to be different people, while slowly, subconsciously, trying to recreate the family we had lost. The daughter who had died in the fire, the child I mourned without understanding why I felt such deep grief for a stranger's tragedy, had been our real daughter. The Jessica, who had been impersonating our fictional college student, looked like our dead child because she was our dead child's sister, the twin who had been staying with relatives the night of the fire and had been presumed dead along with the rest of the family. Detective Chen's investigation had uncovered the truth that both Michael and I had been hiding from ourselves for 2 decades. We weren't identity thieves or murderers. We were trauma survivors who had been so damaged by the loss of our daughter and our home that we had constructed entirely fictional identities to escape the pain of our real lives. The house fire had been an accident caused by faulty wiring, not arson. The false identities had been created by a well-meaning social worker who thought that allowing us to start over with new names might help us heal from our devastating loss. The federal investigation that had flagged Michael's name was actually a review of old missing persons cases, an attempt to reunite families that had been separated by bureaucratic mistakes and incomplete records. The woman who had answered Michael's phone that night hadn't been a stranger or a detective or evidence of some terrible betrayal. She had been our daughter Jessica, our surviving daughter who had spent 20 years searching for the parents she thought had abandoned her after the fire. The voice that had seemed so foreign and threatening was actually the voice of the child we had been mourning for 2 decades, now grown into a woman who had never stopped hoping to find us. As I sat in that hospital room, holding hands with a husband I was only beginning to remember, and looking into the eyes of a daughter I had thought was dead, I realized that the woman who had answered the phone hadn't changed everything by revealing a terrible truth. She had changed everything by helping us remember a love we had never actually lost, just temporarily forgotten in our desperate attempt to survive the most devastating tragedy imaginable. The candles I had lit that evening, the anniversary dinner that had grown cold while I waited, the careful plans that had been shattered by a midnight phone call, none of it had been wasted. It had all been preparation for the moment when my real family would finally come home. The months that followed our reunion were a strange mixture of rediscovering a life we had forgotten and mourning the 20 years we had lost to our shared amnesia. Jessica moved back home, sleeping in what had been our guest room but was actually her childhood bedroom, though none of us could remember painting those walls lavender or hanging the fairy lights she insisted had been there before the fire. Michael and I went to therapy together, trying to piece together fragments of memories that felt like scenes from someone else's movie. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, our trauma specialist, explained that what we had experienced wasn't unusual for survivors of severe psychological trauma. The mind, she said, sometimes protects itself by creating elaborate barriers between the present and an unbearable past. What was unusual was how completely we had constructed new identities and how successfully we had maintained them for 2 decades while living together. But as the sessions progressed and our memories slowly began to return, I started noticing inconsistencies in the stories we were all telling. Jessica would mention details about our old house that didn't match Michael's recollections, or she would refer to family traditions that neither Michael nor I could remember participating in. At first, I attributed these discrepancies to the natural confusion that comes with recovering suppressed memories, but the differences became more pronounced and more troubling as weeks turned into months. The first signs that something was still wrong came during a therapy session in late spring. Dr. Warren was walking us through a memory reconstruction exercise when Jessica casually mentioned that our old house had been blue with white shutters. Both Michael and I were certain it had been yellow with green trim. When Dr. Warren suggested we look at old photographs to clarify the discrepancy, Jessica became visibly agitated and claimed she had lost all her photos in a recent apartment flood. I decided to do some investigating on my own, driving to the neighborhood where our old house had stood before the fire. What I found there didn't match any of our recovered memories. The lot was empty except for an old foundation, but according to the county records, no house had been built there since the 1940s. The address that all 3 of us remembered as our family home had never existed. When I confronted Dr. Warren with this information, her reaction was more alarming than reassuring. Instead of expressing surprise or offering to investigate further, she became defensive and suggested that I was experiencing a form of false memory syndrome that sometimes affects trauma patients when they begin recovering their past. She recommended that I stop researching our old life and focus on building new memories with my reunited family. But I couldn't let it go. Something about Dr. Warren's response felt rehearsed, as if she had been expecting my questions and had prepared her answers in advance. I started keeping a journal of the inconsistencies I noticed in our recovered memories, and the pattern that emerged was deeply disturbing. Every memory that painted our previous life as happy and normal came through clearly and consistently. Every memory that might suggest trauma, conflict, or dysfunction remained frustratingly vague and contradictory. The 21st twist came when I discovered that Dr. Elizabeth Warren wasn't licensed to practice psychology in our state. In fact, according to the state medical board, Dr. Elizabeth Warren had surrendered her license 15 years earlier following an investigation into unethical treatment methods involving memory manipulation and patient exploitation. The woman who had been helping us recover our supposedly suppressed memories was a fraud who specialized in implanting false ones. I confronted Jessica and Michael with this information, expecting them to be as shocked and outraged as I was. Instead, they both became eerily calm and suggested that I was becoming paranoid and obsessive. Jessica said she thought I was having trouble accepting our happy reunion and was looking for reasons to reject the family I had always wanted. Michael agreed, adding that my suspicious behavior was putting unnecessary strain on our healing process. Their synchronized response triggered the return of a memory so vivid and terrifying that it made me physically ill. I remembered sitting in this same living room 20 years earlier, listening to Michael and Jessica have a nearly identical conversation about my mental stability. Not Jessica the daughter we had supposedly lost in a fire, but Jessica the woman who claimed to be our daughter, the woman who had been living in our house and calling herself our child, while systematically convincing me that I was losing my mind. The 20-second revelation hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. There had never been a house fire. There had never been a lost daughter. Michael and I had never been David and Sarah Kowalski, and we hadn't suffered amnesia from any traumatic event. The entire elaborate story about recovered memories and reunited families had been constructed to explain why I was suddenly living with a stranger who claimed to be my daughter and why I couldn't remember anything about my supposed previous life. But if Jessica wasn't our daughter and we weren't trauma survivors with suppressed memories, then what was really happening? The 23rd twist came when I found medical records hidden in Michael's desk drawer, records that revealed the truth about my condition. I wasn't suffering from trauma-induced amnesia. I was in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, and my increasing confusion and memory loss had been used as cover for an elaborate fraud. Jessica wasn't a long-lost daughter or a stranger pretending to be our child. She was a professional caregiver who specialized in exploiting elderly patients with dementia. Michael had hired her to pose as our daughter so that he could convince me to sign over power of attorney and access to our substantial retirement savings. The fake therapy sessions with the unlicensed psychologist were designed to reinforce the false narrative while gradually convincing me that my own perceptions and memories couldn't be trusted. The 24th revelation was even more sinister. Michael hadn't just hired Jessica to help steal our money. He was planning to have me committed to a psychiatric facility once the fraud was complete, claiming that my false memories about not having a daughter proved I was too mentally incompetent to live independently. Jessica would continue to pose as our daughter and next of kin, giving her legal access to our assets while I was locked away in an institution. But the final twist, the 25th and most devastating revelation of all, came when I discovered the truth about who Jessica really was. She wasn't just a hired caregiver or a professional con artist. She was Michael's biological daughter from a previous relationship, a daughter I had never known existed during our 18 years of marriage. The elaborate story about the house fire and recovered memories hadn't been created to steal my money, though that was certainly part of the plan. It had been created to integrate Jessica into our family without having to explain to me why Michael had hidden her existence for nearly 2 decades. Michael's first wife hadn't died in a fire. She had divorced him when she discovered his involvement in a series of financial frauds, taking their daughter and disappearing to protect them both from his criminal associations. Jessica had grown up believing her father was dead, told by her mother that Michael had died in prison rather than the truth about his ongoing criminal activities. When she finally tracked him down as an adult, Michael had convinced her that I was a wealthy widow with no family of my own, someone who would welcome a daughter figure into her life and who would be easy to manipulate due to my progressing dementia. What started as a plan to steal my inheritance had evolved into something much more complex when Jessica realized she genuinely enjoyed having a mother figure, and when Michael began to believe his own lies about our happy family life. The fake therapy sessions and elaborate backstory about recovered memories had become a way for all three of us to pretend we were a real family, while ignoring the criminal conspiracy that had brought us together. The woman who had answered Michael's phone that first night hadn't changed everything by revealing a secret affair or a terrible accident. She had changed everything by forcing me to confront the reality that my own mind was failing me, that the people I trusted most were exploiting my vulnerability, and that the family I thought I had found was built on lies designed to steal everything I had worked for throughout my life. As I sat in our living room, surrounded by the evidence of their deception, I realized that the candles I had lit that anniversary evening had been more prophetic than I could have imagined. They had been burning down slowly and steadily, just like my memories, just like my ability to distinguish truth from fiction, just like the life I had built before Michael and Jessica entered it with their carefully constructed lies. But unlike those candles, I wasn't completely burned out yet. I still had enough clarity left to understand what was happening to me, and I still had enough strength to fight back. The woman who had answered the phone may have revealed the beginning of my mental decline, but she had also given me the chance to take control of my own story before it was too late. I spent the next several weeks pretending to accept their version of reality while secretly documenting their fraud. I recorded conversations where they discussed how to accelerate the process of having me declared incompetent. I photographed financial documents that showed how much money they had already transferred out of our accounts. I collected evidence of Jessica's real identity and her history of elder abuse in other states. Most importantly, I contacted my real family, the sister and brother I hadn't spoken to in years because Michael had convinced me they were trying to steal my inheritance. They had been trying to reach me for months, concerned about reports from neighbors that I seemed confused and was living with people no one had ever seen before. The final confrontation came on what would have been our 19th wedding anniversary. I had prepared the same dinner, lit the same candles, and waited for Michael to come home just as I had a year earlier. When he walked through the door with Jessica, both of them carrying suitcases packed for the trip to Europe they had planned to take with my money, I was ready. Detective Chen was real, though she hadn't been the woman who answered Michael's phone that night. She was the fraud investigator I had contacted, and she was waiting in the kitchen with a warrant for both Michael's and Jessica's arrest. The evidence I had gathered was more than sufficient to charge them with elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. As the handcuffs clicked around Michael's wrists, he looked at me with an expression of genuine surprise, as if he couldn't believe that someone with early-stage dementia had been capable of outsmarting his elaborate scheme. Jessica tried to maintain her role as my loving daughter even as she was being read her rights, begging me to remember all the happy times we had shared together. But I did remember those times, and that was perhaps the cruelest part of this entire experience. The affection Jessica had shown me, the way she had listened to my stories and laughed at my jokes, the comfort of having someone call me Mom after years of loneliness. All of it had been real in the moment, even if it was built on a foundation of lies. The woman who had answered Michael's phone that night a year ago hadn't just changed everything by exposing his deception. She had changed everything by forcing me to confront the reality of my own mortality, the knowledge that my mind was failing and my independence was slipping away. But she had also given me the opportunity to face that reality on my own terms, to maintain my dignity and protect my legacy instead of becoming a victim of my own vulnerability. As I blew out the candles that anniversary evening, watching the smoke curl up toward the ceiling while Detective Chen finished her paperwork, I realized that the woman who had answered the phone had given me the most precious gift imaginable: the chance to write my own ending to a story that others had tried to steal from me.
The house felt different now. Emptier, but somehow cleaner, like a space that had been thoroughly aired out after harboring something toxic for too long. My sister arrived the next morning to help me sort through the aftermath, and together we began the process of rebuilding the connections that Michael had systematically severed over the years. My memories might be fading, and my independence might be limited, but my story was finally my own again. The woman who answered the phone had changed everything, not by destroying the life I thought I had, but by helping me reclaim the life I actually deserved to live. The trial began 6 months later, and I was determined to testify, despite my doctor's concerns about my increasing memory lapses. My sister Margaret had moved in to help care for me, and together we had spent countless hours organizing the evidence I had gathered during those final weeks of living with Michael and Jessica. What I hadn't expected was how much the trial would reveal about the true scope of their criminal enterprise. The prosecution's case seemed straightforward at first. Michael Patterson, whose real name turned out to be Marcus Williams, had a 20-year history of targeting elderly women with cognitive decline. Jessica, whose birth name was Amanda Williams, was indeed his daughter, but she wasn't the innocent victim of her father's manipulation that her defense attorney tried to portray. Together, they had operated this scheme in 7 different states, stealing over $4 million from dozens of victims before they settled on me as their most ambitious target. But as the trial progressed, the 26th twist emerged from an unexpected source. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the fake psychologist who had been helping to reinforce my false memories, took the stand as a prosecution witness. Her testimony revealed that she wasn't just a disgraced therapist who had been hired to manipulate me. She was actually an undercover federal agent who had been investigating Marcus and Amanda for 3 years. The elaborate therapy sessions, the false memory implantation, even her defensive reaction when I questioned our supposed family history, all of it had been part of an FBI operation designed to gather evidence against a criminal network that extended far beyond just Marcus and Amanda. Dr. Warren had been playing a double game, pretending to help them manipulate me while actually documenting their methods for federal prosecutors. The 27th revelation came when Dr. Warren explained that I hadn't been their intended target at all. The FBI had been tracking Marcus and Amanda's movements, expecting them to target a wealthy widow named Helen Morrison, who lived 3 blocks away from me. When they chose me instead, the federal investigation had to be hastily reconfigured to protect me while still gathering evidence against them. But why had they changed targets? The 28th twist was more personal and more painful than anything that had come before. Marcus hadn't chosen me randomly or even because of my substantial retirement savings. He had chosen me because I reminded him of his mother, a woman who had died of Alzheimer's disease while he was serving his first prison sentence for elder fraud 20 years earlier. The psychological evaluation that was part of his pre-sentencing investigation revealed a man driven by a twisted desire to recreate his relationship with his mother, to care for her in the way he hadn't been able to do while he was incarcerated. The elaborate scheme to pose as my loving husband wasn't just about stealing my money. It was about fulfilling a fantasy where he could be the devoted son he believed he should have been. Amanda's motivations were even more complex. The 29th twist came when her own psychological evaluation revealed that she had been sexually abused by Marcus throughout her childhood. Trauma that had been compounded by her mother's suicide when Amanda was 15. Her participation in the elder fraud schemes wasn't just about money or loyalty to her father. It was about recreating family relationships where she held power and control instead of being victimized. Playing the role of my daughter had given Amanda something she had never experienced, a maternal relationship based on affection rather than exploitation. The genuine moments of connection between us, the times when her caring seemed real and spontaneous, hadn't been entirely fabricated.
She had been acting out her own fantasy of what a healthy mother-daughter relationship might look like. But the final and most devastating twist was yet to come. As the sentencing phase of the trial began, my own testimony was interrupted by a medical emergency that would change everything I thought I understood about my situation. I collapsed on the witness stand, and when I regained consciousness in the hospital, Dr. Patricia Hendricks delivered news that shattered the last remaining pieces of my sense of reality. The cognitive decline I had been experiencing wasn't early-stage Alzheimer's disease as previously diagnosed. It was the result of chronic poisoning with small doses of scopolamine, a drug that causes memory loss and increased suggestibility. Someone had been drugging me for over 2 years, slowly destroying my mental capacity to make me a more compliant victim for the fraud scheme. But who had been poisoning me? Marcus and Amanda had only been in my life for 18 months, and the poisoning had started long before I met them. The 30th and final twist came when blood tests revealed that the poisoning was ongoing, even though Marcus and Amanda had been in jail for 6 months and I had been living only with my sister Margaret. Dr. Hendricks ordered immediate tests on everything in my house, from the food in my refrigerator to the soap in my bathroom. The scopolamine was found in my daily vitamins that had been specially prepared and delivered to my house every month by a pharmacy that claimed to specialize in supplements for seniors with cognitive decline. But this wasn't just any pharmacy. It was owned by Margaret's husband, Robert, a man I had trusted implicitly and who had been slowly poisoning me for over 2 years while his wife pretended to be my devoted caretaker. The loving sister who had moved in to protect me from Marcus and Amanda's scheme had actually been part of an even more elaborate conspiracy from the very beginning. Margaret's tearful confession in the hospital waiting room revealed the true scope of the deception I had been living with. She and Robert had been planning to steal my inheritance long before Marcus and Amanda arrived on the scene. The vitamin poisoning had been designed to gradually make me incompetent so they could have me declared mentally unfit and gain control of my assets as my closest living relatives. When Marcus and Amanda showed up with their fake family scheme, Margaret and Robert had initially been furious that someone else was trying to steal what they considered their rightful inheritance. But rather than expose the fraud, they had decided to let Marcus and Amanda do the dirty work of isolating me from other family members and friends, planning to step in as my rescuers once the obvious criminals were arrested. The vitamin poisoning had continued throughout my time with Marcus and Amanda, and Margaret had encouraged me to document their fraud, not out of concern for my well-being, but because she needed evidence to show that I was mentally competent enough to change my will in her favor while simultaneously proving that I needed a guardian to protect me from future exploitation. Margaret had even been feeding information to Marcus and Amanda about my daily routines and financial assets, helping them perfect their scheme while ensuring that they would eventually be caught and removed from the picture. The FBI investigation that had been tracking Marcus and Amanda had missed the larger conspiracy because they had never considered that my own family might be the primary perpetrators. As I sat in that hospital bed, surrounded by the wreckage of every relationship I had trusted over the past 3 years, I realized that the woman who had answered Michael's phone that night had indeed changed everything, but not in any way I could have imagined. She had started a chain of events that would ultimately expose not just one elaborate fraud, but a series of interconnected schemes that had involved nearly everyone in my life. The trial was postponed while federal investigators expanded their case to include Margaret and Robert. The pharmacy that had been providing my poisoned vitamins was revealed to be part of a nationwide network that targeted elderly clients, slowly damaging their cognitive function to make them vulnerable to financial exploitation by family members, caregivers, and professional criminals. Dr. Warren, who had been posing as the fake psychologist, was actually part of a joint FBI and DEA task force that had been investigating this network for 5 years. My case had been their break in the investigation, providing evidence of how the various criminal elements work together to systematically exploit vulnerable seniors. The final trial lasted 3 months and resulted in convictions for 17 people across 6 states. Marcus received 25 years for his role as the primary architect of the false family schemes. Amanda received 15 years, with the possibility of parole in 8 if she continued to cooperate with ongoing investigations. Preserve the original language of 20 years each for the poisoning conspiracy and their role in the larger criminal network. But perhaps the most shocking revelation came during Robert's sentencing hearing, when he finally admitted that the entire conspiracy had been planned from the moment I inherited my late husband's life insurance policy 15 years earlier. My husband's death, which I had always believed was from natural causes, had actually been the result of the same slow poisoning that had been used on me. Robert had been my husband's business partner and had been embezzling money from their accounting firm for years. When my husband began to suspect the theft, Robert had started the vitamin poisoning to make him appear mentally unstable and unreliable. The heart attack that killed my husband had been induced by a different drug, one that would mimic the symptoms of natural cardiac failure in a man who was already known to be under stress and acting irrationally due to the cognitive effects of the scopolamine. The woman who had answered my husband's phone that terrible night 2 years ago hadn't just exposed an affair or a current crime. She had been the first thread that, when pulled, unraveled a conspiracy that had been destroying my life for over 15 years. Every major tragedy I had experienced, every loss I had mourned, every moment of confusion and self-doubt I had endured had been orchestrated by people who were supposed to love and protect me. As I sat in the courtroom during Robert's sentencing, listening to him finally tell the truth about my husband's murder, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: clarity. The cognitive effects of the chronic poisoning were slowly reversing now that the toxins were out of my system. My memory was improving, my thinking was becoming sharper, and for the first time in decades, I could trust my own perceptions about what was real and what was fabricated. The judge asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement, and I stood on unsteady legs to address the man who had stolen 20 years of my life and murdered the person I loved most in the world. I told him that the woman who answered the phone that night had changed everything, but not because she had destroyed my faith in human nature or my ability to trust others. She had changed everything because she had given me the opportunity to reclaim my own story, to separate truth from lies, and to understand that surviving betrayal isn't about learning to trust again. It's about learning to trust yourself, to believe in your own perceptions, and to fight for your own version of reality, even when everyone around you insists that your memories are wrong and your instincts are unreliable. The settlement from the wrongful death lawsuit and the restitution from the criminal cases would ensure that I could live comfortably for the rest of my life. But money had never been what this was really about. It had been about something much more precious: the right to know the truth about my own life and the power to decide what that truth meant. As I walked out of that courtroom for the final time, I thought about the candles I had lit so many times over the years, waiting for people who would never come home, trusting people who were systematically betraying me, believing stories that had been carefully constructed to keep me isolated and vulnerable. The woman who answered the phone had changed everything by lighting a different kind of candle, one that illuminated the darkness that had surrounded me for so long. She had given me the chance to see my life clearly, perhaps for the first time in decades. And to understand that the greatest betrayal wasn't what others had done to me. The greatest betrayal had been my willingness to doubt my own instincts, to accept other people's versions of reality when my gut told me something was wrong, to prioritize keeping the peace over seeking the truth. The woman who answered the phone had changed everything by reminding me that my own voice, my own perceptions, my own story mattered more than maintaining the comfortable lies that others wanted me to believe. Now, as I sit in my own home with new locks on the doors and a security system that I control, I light candles every evening not because I'm waiting for someone to come home, but because I'm celebrating the fact that I finally am home. Home in my own life, home in my own truth, home in the knowledge that I survived the worst betrayals imaginable and emerged with my essential self intact. The woman who answered the phone changed everything.
And I will be grateful to her for the rest of my life.